Hey everyone, I'd been lurking here for a while, never thinking I'd be the kind of guy to pour his heart out on the internet. But life has a funny way of hitting you where it hurts, and I guess I just need to get this off my chest. My name's Eric, not my real name. I'm 36, and until recently, I thought I had a good life. My wife, Jessica, and I have been together for 10 years. We have an 8-year-old son, Connor, who's the center of my world. Jessica and I met in college, and it was one of those whirlwind things, instant connection, sparks, the whole fairy tale. She was driven, funny, and could light up a room. When we got married, I felt like the luckiest guy alive. We've had our ups and downs, sure. Who doesn't? But I thought we had something real, something solid. That belief has been the foundation of every decision I've made for the last decade. I never imagined I'd be the guy writing a post like this, but here we are. It all started about a year ago. Jessica got a promotion at work, a big one. She'd been working toward it for years, and I was genuinely proud of her. She was over the moon, and for a while, it seemed like everything was going great. But then the changes started, subtle at first. The promotion came with longer hours, more responsibilities, and frequent business trips. At first, I didn't think much of it. I mean, she was working hard, and I wanted to support her. But then she started pulling away from me, emotionally and physically. Conversations became one-sided, and she was constantly on her phone, claiming it was work. She even started sleeping in the guest room, saying she didn't want to disturb me when she got home late. I tried to be understanding. I figured it was the stress of her new role. I picked up the slack at home, cooking, cleaning, helping Connor with his homework. I wanted to be her rock, the person she could lean on. But instead of bringing us closer, it felt like she was drifting further away. There were moments that gnawed at me. Like the night she came home wearing a men's hoodie. It wasn't hers, and it definitely wasn't mine. When I asked about it, she laughed it off and said a coworker lent it to her because she got cold at the office. A coworker who wears cologne, apparently, because the hoodie reeked of it. I wanted to believe her. I really did. But something about the way she said it, so casual, so dismissive, didn't sit right. I'm not a jealous guy by nature, but the whole thing felt off. Then there were the trips. They became more frequent, more last minute. She'd barely give me any details, just say it was for work and leave me to handle everything at home. Once, she left for an overnight trip but came back 2 days later. When I asked why she didn't let me know she'd be gone longer, she rolled her eyes and said her phone died. I started noticing other things too. Like how she'd always keep her phone on her, even in the bathroom. Or how she suddenly cared about how she looked when she left the house, even for mundane errands. She started working out more, buying new clothes, and spending hours doing her makeup, things she never used to bother with. I didn't know what to think. Was I imagining things? Was I being paranoid? I tried to brush it off, to tell myself I was overreacting. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. One night, Connor asked me why Mommy didn't want to eat dinner with us anymore. I didn't know what to say. How do you explain to an 8-year-old that sometimes grown-ups get so wrapped up in their own lives they forget the people who matter most? I just told him she was busy with work, and that she loved him very much. But even as I said it, I wasn't sure if I believed it anymore. That's when I started paying closer attention. I didn't want to be that guy, the one who snoops through his wife's things or jumps to conclusions without proof. But I couldn't ignore the growing knot in my stomach, the feeling that something was very, very wrong. And then, one night, I found something that changed everything. It was a Wednesday night. Jessica was working late, as usual, and Connor had gone to bed after we read his favorite dinosaur book together. I was sitting in the living room, flipping through the TV channels but not really watching. My mind was racing, replaying all the little things that didn't add up. The hoodie. The long trips. The phone always glued to her side. I don't know what compelled me to do it, but I walked into the guest room. Jessica had been practically living there for the past few weeks, claiming the bed in our room was too firm, and that she needed better sleep to focus at work. Her laptop bag was on the desk, and I saw her work tablet sitting next to it. I told myself I was just going to check the time on the tablet. That's all. But when I picked it up, the screen lit up, and I saw a series of text notifications. The messages weren't locked, so I could see snippets of the conversation. It wasn't work. The messages were from my brother David. I froze, staring at the screen. My brother David, the one who had been staying with us on and off for the past year while he got back on his feet. David, who had always been a little too charming for his own good, but I never thought anything of it because he was family. The messages were casual but loaded with subtext. David, last night was amazing. I can't stop thinking about you. Jessica, you're going to get us caught if you keep texting like this. David, Eric's clueless. We're fine. My heart stopped. My vision blurred. I felt like someone had punched me in the stomach, and I couldn't breathe. I scrolled up, unable to stop myself. There were photos, nothing explicit but enough to confirm what I was seeing. Pictures of them together at places Jessica had claimed were work-related trips. A selfie of them at a cabin in the mountains, smiling like they didn't have a care in the world. I felt sick. My brother. My wife. The two people I trusted most in the world were betraying me right under my nose. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at the screen. Minutes? Hours? Time seemed to stop. Eventually, I put the tablet back down and walked out of the room like I was on autopilot. I went outside, sat on the porch, and tried to process what I had just seen. How long had this been going on? How could they do this to me? To Connor? I thought about confronting Jessica right then and there, but I didn't trust myself not to lose it. I needed to think, to figure out what to do. Part of me wanted to call David and rip into him, but what would that solve? I sat there for hours, trying to keep it together. When Jessica finally came home, she breezed past me without a second glance, mumbling something about being exhausted. She didn't even notice the look on my face. I knew I had to confront her. But how do you confront someone who's been lying to you for God knows how long? Someone who's been sneaking around with your own brother? That night I didn't sleep. The next morning, I woke up feeling like I hadn't slept at all. Jessica was in the kitchen, sipping her coffee and scrolling through her phone like it was just another day. I stood there in the doorway, watching her, and my stomach turned. How could she act so normal, so casual, after everything? Jessica, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. She looked up, surprised by my tone. Yeah? We need to talk. She furrowed her brow, her classic. What now? Look. Can it wait? I've got a meeting in an hour. No, it can't, I said, sharper this time. I know about you and David. Her face froze for a split second before she recovered. But I saw it, the flicker of panic, the crack in her armor. She set her mug down and crossed her arms. What are you talking about? Don't play dumb, Jessica. I saw the messages on your tablet. The photos. Everything. Her jaw tightened, and for a moment, I thought she might deny it outright. But instead, she rolled her eyes and sighed. Jesus, Eric. I didn't think you were the type to snoop through my stuff. That's what you're focusing on. I snapped. Not the fact that you're sleeping with my brother? She groaned, like I was being unreasonable. It's not what you think. I laughed bitterly. Oh, really? So, what is it then? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've been sneaking around behind my back with my own brother. It just happened, okay? She said, her voice rising. I didn't plan for this. I didn't want this. Didn't want this? I repeated, incredulous. Jessica, you made choices. Over and over again you chose this. Don't act like you're some helpless victim here. She threw her hands up. You don't get it, Eric. You don't know what it's like to feel invisible in your own marriage. All you ever care about is Connor and your work. I've felt alone for years. That hit me like a slap in the face. So, instead of talking to me, you turned to David? My brother? You couldn't pick a stranger or a coworker. You had to go for the ultimate betrayal? Her expression shifted, hardening. You're not exactly perfect either, Eric. You're distant, boring, predictable. I needed something else. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Predictable? You mean stable? The guy who works his ass off to give you and Connor a good life? That's what you're complaining about. She didn't respond. Instead, she grabbed her phone and started scrolling, ignoring me like the conversation was over. That's when I lost it. This isn't just about us, Jessica. Connor is going to be crushed when he finds out his mom is a liar and a cheater. What kind of example are you setting for him? She finally looked up, her face red with anger. Don't you dare bring Connor into this. He doesn't need to know anything. This is between us. Like hell it is, I said. He's our son, Jessica. Everything we do affects him. Or have you been too busy with David to realize that? She stormed out of the kitchen, muttering something about needing space to think. I let her go, partly because I couldn't stand to look at her anymore and partly because I was afraid of what I might say next. I felt shattered, but the worst part was knowing this was just the beginning. The next morning felt surreal, like I was walking through someone else's life. Jessica was already in the kitchen when I got up, sipping coffee and scrolling through her phone, her face calm and unbothered. How could she act so normal after everything? I stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her. It was like I was seeing her for the first time, the cracks in the image of the person I thought I knew. Jessica, I said finally, my voice cutting through the quiet. She looked up, startled by my tone. Yeah? We need to talk, I said, stepping closer. She tilted her head, annoyed. Now? I have a meeting in an hour. No, it can't wait. I met her gaze, and my voice was firm. I know about you and David. The shift in her expression was immediate. Her body stiffened, and her eyes darted to the side for a fraction of a second. She recovered quickly, but I'd seen it, that flash of guilt, of panic. What are you talking about? She said, her tone defensive but her voice a little too high-pitched. Don't insult my intelligence, Jessica. I saw the messages. The photos. Everything. Her face hardened, and I could see her brain working, trying to decide whether to deny it or spin it. Finally, she sighed and set her coffee down. Jesus, Eric. I didn't think you were the type to go snooping through my stuff. That's your concern? That I looked at your tablet? My voice rose with disbelief. Not that you're screwing my brother behind my back? She groaned, throwing her hands up. It's not like that. I laughed bitterly. Then explain it to me, Jessica. What is it like? Because from where I'm standing, it looks pretty clear. It just happened, okay? She said, her voice rising. I didn't plan this. I didn't want this. You didn't want this? I repeated, the anger boiling over. Jessica, you made choices. Over and over again you chose this. Don't act like you're some kind of victim. Her face twisted with frustration. You don't understand, Eric. You don't know what it's like to feel invisible in your own marriage. All you ever care about is Connor and your work. I've felt alone for years. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. Invisible? I'd been bending over backward to support her, to give her the freedom to chase her career while I took care of everything at home. Alone? Are you serious? Instead of talking to me, you turned to David? My brother? Do you have any idea what you've done? She crossed her arms, glaring at me. You're not perfect either, Eric. You're distant. Predictable. Boring. I needed something else. I felt like I was drowning. Predictable? Boring? I'd thought stability and commitment were things to be proud of, not reasons to be discarded. So that's your excuse? I was too dependable for you. Too focused on keeping our family together? Her silence was deafening. She picked up her phone, scrolling like I wasn't even there, like the conversation was over. I couldn't hold it in anymore. You know what hurts the most. Connor. He looks up to you, Jessica. He loves you. And this is what you're teaching him about love and trust. Her head snapped up, her face flushed with anger. Don't you dare bring Connor into this. He doesn't need to know anything. This is between us. No, Jessica. It's not. He's our son. Everything we do affects him. Or have you been too busy sneaking around with David to think about that? Her face crumpled for a moment, but she quickly masked it with anger. She grabbed her mug and stormed out of the kitchen. I can't deal with this right now, she muttered over her shoulder. I let her go, partly because I didn't trust myself to keep my cool if the conversation continued and partly because I needed a moment to think. I stood there in the empty kitchen, the weight of her betrayal pressing down on me like a physical force. My wife. My brother. The two people I trusted most in the world. How could they do this? I knew this wasn't the end of it. Far from it. But at that moment, I didn't know what my next move should be. Jessica left the house after our confrontation. She didn't say where she was going or when she'd be back, and for the first time in 10 years I didn't care. Let her run. Let her go to David, or wherever she needed to hide from the fallout. I stayed in the kitchen for a long time, staring at the table where we'd shared countless meals as a family, where Connor would giggle over silly stories while Jessica and I would exchange knowing smiles. That table felt like a graveyard now, a tombstone for the life I thought we had. Connor came downstairs after a while, rubbing his eyes and clutching his favorite stuffed dinosaur. "Where's Mom?" he asked, his voice groggy. "She had to step out," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Is she coming back?" The question hit me harder than I expected. I wanted to promise him she would, but the truth was, I didn't know. Instead, I just nodded. "Yeah, buddy. She'll be back later." I spent the rest of the day trying to act normal for Connor's sake. We played board games, built a fort in the living room, and watched a movie together. But every laugh, every smile felt forced. My mind was stuck on Jessica and David, replaying every moment I'd missed the signs. Late that night, after I'd tucked Connor into bed, I sat on the couch with my phone in my hand, debating whether to call David. I didn't want to, God, I didn't want to, but I needed answers. Finally, I dialed his number. He picked up on the third ring, sounding groggy. "Eric? It's late, man. What's up?" I didn't waste time with pleasantries. "You know what's up, David. Don't play dumb." There was a long pause. Then he sighed. "So, I guess you found out." His tone was casual, almost bored, and it made my blood boil. "Yeah, I found out." "How long, David? How long have you been screwing my wife?" "Eric, listen." "No! You don't get to listen me," I snapped. "Answer the question." He sighed again, like this was some minor inconvenience for him. "A few months. It wasn't supposed to be a big deal. Things just got out of hand." "A few months?" I said, my voice shaking. "You've been living in my house, eating my food, and you had the audacity to betray me like this? How could you, David? You're my brother." "Look, I didn't plan for this to happen," he said, his voice defensive now. "Jessica and I just connected. She told me how unhappy she was, how you weren't paying attention to her." "She what?" I interrupted, incredulous. "That's your excuse? She badmouthed me, and you thought, hey, I'll just destroy my brother's marriage? Are you serious right now?" "Calm down, Eric," he said, his tone condescending. "It's not like you were perfect, okay? You're not some saint." I wanted to reach through the phone and throttle him. "You're unbelievable," I said, my voice low and furious. "You don't get to shift the blame onto me. You betrayed me, David. You betrayed Connor." "And for what?" "A fling?" "It wasn't just a fling," he said quietly. Those words hit me like a truck. I didn't want to believe it, but the weight in his voice told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't some impulsive mistake. This was deliberate. I ended the call without another word and threw my phone onto the couch. My hands were shaking, my chest tight with anger and pain. How could my own brother do this to me? How could Jessica? That night I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them together, laughing, touching, sharing moments that should have been mine. By morning, I knew one thing for sure: this wasn't just about my marriage anymore. It was about my family, my son, and figuring out how to move forward in a world that felt like it had been turned upside down. The morning after that call with David, I felt like I'd aged a decade overnight. Every part of me was heavy with anger, betrayal, and heartbreak. Jessica still wasn't home, and I didn't even bother trying to reach her. What could she possibly say that would make this better? Connor was already up, sitting on the couch with his tablet, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing in his family. I envied him in that moment, his innocence, his simple joy. I wanted to protect him from all of this, but deep down, I knew there was no way to shield him forever. I made breakfast, even though I wasn't hungry, and tried to focus on Connor. But my thoughts kept drifting to Jessica and David. Were they together now, laughing at how easily they'd fooled me? Did she even feel guilty? Around mid-morning, Jessica finally walked through the door. She looked disheveled, like she hadn't slept, but there was no remorse in her expression, just irritation, like she was the one who'd been wrong. "Where were you?" I asked, keeping my voice calm for Connor's sake. "Out," she said flatly, dropping her bag on the floor. "Out where?" I pressed, lowering my voice so Connor wouldn't hear. "Don't start, Eric," she snapped. "I needed some space." "Is that a crime now?" I clenched my fists, forcing myself to stay composed. "We need to talk." "Alone," she sighed dramatically. "Fine. Let me get some coffee first." I followed her into the kitchen, my anger simmering just below the surface. As soon as the door swung shut, I let it out. "Where were you, Jessica? With David?" Her hand froze mid-pour, but she didn't look at me. "I told you I needed space." "That's not an answer," I said, my voice rising. "Were you with him?" She set the coffee pot down and turned to face me, arms crossed. "Yes, okay? I was with David." "Happy now? Happy?" The word was so absurd it made me laugh, a bitter, hollow sound. "Happy? Are you serious? Do you even hear yourself?" Her expression hardened. "What do you want me to say, Eric? That I'm sorry? That I regret it? Because I don't. You've been checked out of this marriage for years. I didn't ask for this to happen, but it did." I stared at her, stunned. "You don't regret it? Jessica, you blew up our family. For what? Because you felt neglected? You could have talked to me, but instead, you chose to cheat with my brother." Her eyes flashed with anger. "Talk to you? About what, Eric? Every time I tried, you brushed me off or acted like I was overreacting. You were too busy playing the perfect dad and the dependable husband to see what was happening right in front of you." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "So, this is my fault now? You're the victim?" "I didn't say that," she snapped. "But maybe if you'd paid a little more attention, things wouldn't have gotten this bad." I shook my head, disbelief washing over me. "You're unbelievable. Do you even care about Connor? About what this is going to do to him?" Her face softened for a moment, but only a moment. "Of course I care. But he doesn't need to know. Not yet." "Not yet?" I repeated, my voice dripping with sarcasm. "When, Jessica? When he's old enough to realize his mom is a liar and a cheat?" Her face twisted with anger. "You don't get to act like you're perfect, Eric. This marriage didn't fall apart because of one mistake. It was broken long before David came into the picture." I felt the last thread of my patience snap. "Then why didn't you leave? Why stay and pretend everything was fine while you stabbed me in the back?" She didn't answer. Instead, she grabbed her coffee and walked out of the room, leaving me standing there, furious and broken. I spent the rest of the day avoiding her, focusing all my attention on Connor. Every time I looked at him, my heart ached. How was I going to explain this to him? How could I possibly make this okay? By the time night fell, I knew one thing for certain: this wasn't just about my marriage anymore. It was about protecting Connor, no matter what it took. That night, after Connor was asleep, I sat alone in the living room, staring at the blank TV screen. Jessica was upstairs in the guest room, the same room where I'd first stumbled across the truth. The house felt suffocating, filled with the weight of unspoken words and shattered trust. I knew one thing for certain: whatever happened between Jessica and me, Connor came first. He didn't deserve to be dragged through this mess, and I was determined to shield him as much as I could. The next morning, I woke up early and started making calls. I reached out to a lawyer I'd heard about through a friend, a guy who specialized in family law. I didn't want to go nuclear, not yet, but I needed to know my options. When I explained the situation, the lawyer was calm but firm. "Eric, if this goes to court, the judge will look at what's in Connor's best interest. If you're aiming for custody, you'll need to show that you can provide a stable environment for him." A stable environment. That phrase echoed in my head. Could I even claim that right now? My wife was sleeping with my brother, and my home life felt like it was held together by duct tape and denial. Still, I couldn't let her turn this around on me. Jessica had already tried to blame me for her affair, and I wouldn't put it past her to twist things in court. I started documenting everything: texts, photos, even the messages I'd found on her tablet. It felt dirty, like I was betraying the sanctity of our marriage even further, but I reminded myself that Jessica had already crossed that line. I was just doing what I needed to protect my son. Meanwhile, things with Jessica went from bad to worse. She barely spoke to me unless it was about Connor, and even then, her words were clipped and cold. She spent most of her time out of the house, and when she was home, she stayed holed up in the guest room or on her phone. Connor started asking more questions. Why isn't Mommy eating dinner with us? Why does she sleep in the other room? I tried my best to brush it off. Mommy's really busy with work right now, I said, even though the lie tasted bitter in my mouth. One night, as I was tucking him into bed, he looked up at me with those big, innocent eyes and asked, "Are you and Mommy mad at each other?" My throat tightened. "Why do you ask that, buddy?" He shrugged, fiddling with the corner of his blanket. "You don't hug her anymore. And she doesn't laugh with you like she used to." I felt like my heart was breaking all over again. "Sometimes grown-ups have hard days, Connor," I said carefully. "But no matter what, Mommy and I both love you very much. Okay?" He nodded, but the sadness in his eyes lingered. After I left his room, I sat on the stairs and broke down. This wasn't just about me anymore. Connor was already feeling the cracks in our family, and I couldn't keep pretending everything was fine. Jessica and I needed to have a serious conversation about what came next. Whether it was mediation, divorce, or something else, we couldn't keep living like this. It wasn't fair to Connor or to me. But I also knew that with David in the picture, nothing about this was going to be easy. That night, after Connor was asleep, I found myself sitting in the dark living room again, staring at nothing and feeling like everything was collapsing around me. The house felt empty, even though Jessica was still upstairs in the guest room. We hadn't spoken more than a few sentences all day, and when we did, it was tense and transactional. I hated this silence. But more than that, I hated what it symbolized: the end of what I thought we had, the breakdown of the life we built for Connor. Connor. My thoughts always came back to him. How was I going to protect him from this mess? He was only 8, but he was sharp. He noticed things, picked up on the tension even when I tried my best to hide it. The next morning, I decided to take action. I woke up early, while the house was still quiet, and started researching family lawyers. I needed advice, someone who could help me figure out how to protect my rights as a father. I found a firm with good reviews and made an appointment for later that week. When I sat down with the lawyer, a no-nonsense woman named Karen, I laid everything out. The affair, the betrayal, my concerns about Connor, everything. She listened carefully, nodding as I spoke, and when I was done, she leaned back in her chair and gave me a steady look. "Eric," she said, "you're in a tough spot, but you're doing the right thing by getting ahead of this. If this goes to court, the judge will prioritize what's in Connor's best interest. That means stability, a safe environment, and a strong relationship with both parents. If you're aiming for custody, you'll need to document everything. Be prepared to show that you're the parent who can provide consistency and emotional support. The word custody hit me hard. I hadn't even let myself think that far ahead yet, but hearing it out loud made it real. I knew I needed to be ready for whatever came next. Karen advised me to start keeping a detailed record: texts, photos, conversations with Jessica, anything that could show a pattern of instability or neglect on her part. It felt wrong, like I was gearing up for war against someone I'd once loved deeply. But Jessica had already crossed so many lines, and I couldn't afford to let my emotions blind me to the reality of the situation. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about Connor. Meanwhile, life at home kept unraveling. Jessica was rarely around. When she was, she stayed in the guest room, her phone always glued to her hand. We barely spoke, and when we did, it was tense and clipped. She didn't even try to hide her disdain anymore, like she was daring me to confront her again. Connor started noticing more. "Why doesn't Mommy eat dinner with us anymore?" he asked one night, his voice small and uncertain. "She's really busy with work," I said, forcing a smile that felt like it might crack my face. He frowned. "She's always busy. Doesn't she like eating with us?" I wanted to tell him the truth, but how do you explain something like this to an 8-year-old? Instead, I just said, "She loves you very much, Connor. She's just going through a tough time right now." That seemed to satisfy him for the moment, but his questions didn't stop. One evening, as I was tucking him into bed, he looked up at me with those wide, innocent eyes and said, "Are you and Mommy mad at each other?" His question hit me like a punch to the gut. I hesitated, trying to find the right words. "Why do you ask that, buddy?" He shrugged, fiddling with the edge of his blanket. "You don't hug her anymore. And you don't laugh together like you used to." I swallowed hard, my chest aching. "Sometimes grown-ups go through hard things, Connor," I said carefully. "But no matter what, we both love you very much. That will never change." He nodded, but the look in his eyes told me he didn't completely understand. How could he? After I left his room, I sat on the stairs, my head in my hands. This wasn't sustainable. I couldn't keep pretending everything was fine, not when Connor was already feeling the cracks in our family. I needed to have a serious conversation with Jessica about what came next. But I also knew that with David in the picture, this wasn't going to be simple. Jessica had already shown she wasn't willing to take accountability for her actions, and I didn't trust her to make decisions that put Connor's best interests first. That night, I started documenting everything. I went through my texts with Jessica, saving any messages that showed her distance or hostility. I took screenshots of the messages between her and David that I'd found on her tablet. I even wrote down notes about the conversations we'd had and the things Connor had said. It felt cold and calculated, but I reminded myself it wasn't about revenge. It was about protecting my son. Jessica and I couldn't keep living like this, circling each other like strangers in a war zone. But I also couldn't trust her to handle this the right way. I had to be ready for whatever came next. The tension in the house was unbearable. Jessica and I barely spoke, and when we did, it was either about Connor or laced with thinly veiled hostility. I kept telling myself I needed to have a real conversation with her, but every time I looked at her, all I could see was the betrayal. And every time I thought about David, my blood boiled. One night, about a week after our last confrontation, Jessica came home late. Connor was already asleep, and I was sitting at the kitchen table, nursing a glass of whiskey and staring at the wall. She walked in without a word, dropped her bag on the floor, and started rifling through the fridge like nothing was wrong. "Where were you?" I asked, my voice low and steady. "Out," she said, not even turning around. "With him?" She slammed the fridge door shut and spun around, her face a mixture of anger and defiance. "I don't have to answer that." My jaw tightened. "You don't have to, but it says everything." She rolled her eyes. "You're exhausting, Eric. Do you know that? You've been sulking around here like some wounded puppy, making this whole thing about you." "Making it about me?" I said, standing up. "You slept with my brother, Jessica. You lied to me." You blew up our family, and I'm the one making this about me? She crossed her arms, glaring at me. We haven't been a family in a long time, Eric. You just didn't want to see it. Her words cut deep, but I refused to let her see how much they hurt. You can tell yourself whatever you need to justify what you've done, but don't try to rewrite history. We had problems, sure, but you didn't even try to fix them. You just ran to David. She scoffed. Oh, please. Don't act like you're some innocent victim. You've been checked out of this marriage for years. All you care about is Connor and your job. That's because someone had to care. I snapped. While you were off chasing your connection with my brother, I was the one holding everything together. For you. For Connor. Her face twisted with anger. I'm not going to stand here and let you lecture me, Eric. I don't owe you anything. That was it. That was the moment I realized we were past the point of no return. You owe me the truth, I said, my voice shaking with anger. And you owe Connor a mother who actually gives a damn about her family. She flinched at that, but only for a second. Then she grabbed her bag and stormed out of the kitchen, slamming the door behind her. I sat back down at the table, my hands trembling as I stared into my glass. How had it come to this? 10 years of marriage, a life we'd built together, and now it was all ashes. Later that night, when I was lying awake in bed, I heard her come back. She didn't try to talk to me. She just went straight to the guest room and shut the door. The next morning, I woke up to find her sitting at the kitchen table, her phone in one hand and a cup of coffee in the other. She looked up as I walked in, her expression unreadable. We need to figure this out, she said, her voice cold and detached. I nodded, taking a seat across from her. Yeah. We do. For the first time, we actually talked about what came next. It wasn't a productive conversation, it was more of a negotiation. She wanted to keep things as quiet as possible, for Connor's sake, but I could see through her. She didn't want the affair getting out because it would ruin her carefully curated image. I'm not going to drag Connor through this, I said. But I'm also not going to let you and David dictate how this ends. Her eyes narrowed. What does that mean? It means I've already spoken to a lawyer, I said, watching her face carefully. And if you try to pull anything, I'll do whatever it takes to protect Connor. Her expression faltered for a moment before she recovered. Fine. If you want to play the lawyer game, go ahead. But don't think for a second that you're the only one who cares about him. The conversation ended there, either of us willing to give an inch. Over the next few days, I started laying the groundwork for the inevitable. I set up a separate bank account, consulted with my lawyer about custody options, and began looking for a therapist who could help Connor navigate what was coming. I still didn't know exactly how this was going to end, but one thing was clear: there was no going back. In the days that followed, the house felt like a war zone caught in a strange calm. Jessica and I avoided each other as much as possible, and when we did speak, it was clipped and cold. The unspoken tension hung in the air like a thick fog, and even Connor seemed to feel it. One evening, as I was helping Connor with his homework, he asked the question I'd been dreading. Dad, are you and Mom gonna get a divorce? I froze, my hands still on the math worksheet we'd been working on. What makes you ask that, buddy? I tried to keep my voice calm, but my heart was racing. He shrugged, looking down at the paper. I heard kids at school talking about their parents getting divorced. They said their moms and dads were mad all the time, like you and Mom. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to meet his eyes. Connor, no matter what happens, both your mom and I love you more than anything. That's never going to change, okay? He nodded, but I could tell he wasn't satisfied with the answer. I just want things to go back to normal, he said quietly. Normal. That word hit me like a punch to the gut. Normal wasn't an option anymore, and I hated that he was caught in the middle of this mess. Later that night, after Connor was asleep, Jessica came downstairs. She was wearing the hoodie, the same one she'd brought home months ago that had first planted the seed of doubt in my mind. Seeing it now felt like a slap in the face, a visual reminder of everything we'd lost. We need to talk, she said, her tone icy but resolute. I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms. I'm listening. She sat down across from me, her fingers tapping nervously on the table. I've been thinking about what you said. About Connor. And you're right, we can't keep doing this. It's not fair to him. Her words surprised me, but I didn't let it show. So, what's your plan? I think we should separate, she said, her voice steady but devoid of emotion. We'll figure out custody arrangements and try to keep things as civil as possible for Connor's sake. I nodded slowly, my mind racing. And David? Her face hardened. David isn't your concern. I laughed bitterly. He's not my concern? He's my brother, Jessica. He's living in my house. He's part of this whether you like it or not. Her jaw tightened, but she didn't respond. Let me make this clear, I said, leaning forward. If you think for 1 second that I'm going to let you and David play house with my son, you're delusional. Connor doesn't need to be around that. She glared at me. Don't you dare try to paint me as a bad mother. I've always been there for Connor. Being there physically isn't the same as being there emotionally. I shot back. And if you think a judge won't take your affair into account during a custody battle, you're sorely mistaken. Her face went pale, but she quickly recovered. You're not taking him from me, Eric. I'm not trying to take him from you, I said, my voice firm but calm. I just want what's best for him. And that's not going to include David. She stared at me for a long moment before standing up. Fine. We'll let the lawyers handle it. Fine, I said, watching as she walked out of the room. That night I couldn't sleep. My mind was a whirlwind of anger, sadness, and fear. I hated the idea of dragging this out in court, but I couldn't let Jessica and David dictate the terms of my son's future. The next morning, I called my lawyer and told her everything. She listened patiently, then said, Eric, this is going to be a long and difficult process, but you're doing the right thing. Just remember, stay focused on Connor. Judges care about the child's well-being above all else. Document everything, stay calm, and don't let your emotions get the better of you. I thanked her and hung up, feeling a strange mix of relief and dread. This was it, the beginning of the end. But at least now, I had a plan. That afternoon, Jessica came downstairs with a suitcase. I'm going to stay with a friend for a while, she said, avoiding my eyes. David? I asked flatly. She hesitated, then nodded. I felt the familiar wave of anger rising, but I pushed it down. Fine. Do whatever you need to do. But don't think for a second that this is over. She didn't respond. She just grabbed her suitcase and walked out the door without looking back. As the sound of her car faded into the distance, I stood there in the empty house, feeling both relieved and heartbroken. This was the start of a new chapter, and while it wasn't one I'd ever wanted, I knew I had to face it head-on. For Connor. The house felt eerily quiet after Jessica left. It was the kind of silence that wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, oppressive, and filled with the echoes of everything that had gone wrong. Connor asked where his mom was the next morning, his big eyes full of confusion. She's staying with a friend for a little while, I told him, trying to keep my voice even. Why? He asked, his voice small. I paused, struggling to find the right words. Sometimes grown-ups need time to figure things out. But she loves you very much, and you'll see her soon. He nodded slowly, but the sadness in his eyes broke me. I wanted to promise him that everything would be okay, but I couldn't. Not yet. Over the next few days, I threw myself into being there for Connor. I made his favorite meals, helped him with his homework, and tried to keep our routine as normal as possible. But every time I tucked him in at night, I could see the questions he wasn't asking, the ones I didn't have answers to. Meanwhile, I focused on preparing for the inevitable custody battle. My lawyer Karen was a godsend. She walked me through the process, helping me understand what the court would consider when deciding custody. Eric, she said during one of our meetings, your biggest strength is your consistency. You've been Connor's primary caregiver, especially with Jessica working long hours. Judges look for stability, and you've already demonstrated that. Her words gave me some hope, but there was still a part of me that couldn't believe this was my life now, fighting my wife and my brother for the right to raise my own son. Then came the first bombshell. Jessica served me with official separation papers. It wasn't unexpected, but seeing it in black and white made it real. In the documents, she was asking for joint custody of Connor, along with what she described as a fair division of assets. I felt my stomach twist as I read through the papers. Joint custody was one thing, but what infuriated me was the implication that she could move forward with David and pretend this whole mess was normal. I called Karen immediately. "I don't want him anywhere near David," I said, pacing the living room. "Connor doesn't need to be exposed to that." Karen sighed. "I understand where you're coming from, but unless you can prove that David poses a direct threat to Connor's well-being, the court might not see it that way. We'll make the case, but you need to be prepared for a fight." Prepared for a fight. That seemed to be the theme of my life now. The next week, Jessica came by to pick up some of her things. She texted me beforehand, telling me she'd only be there for a few minutes. I made sure Connor was at a friend's house. I didn't want him to see her right now. When she arrived, I watched as she moved through the house like a stranger, gathering her clothes and personal items. She didn't look at me, and I didn't try to speak to her. As she was about to leave, she finally stopped in the doorway and turned to me. "We can make this easy, Eric, or we can make it hard. It's your choice." I stared at her, the woman I'd spent 10 years of my life with, and I barely recognized her. "Easy?" I said, my voice low. "You think any of this is easy? You destroyed our family, Jessica. You don't get to stand there and act like you're the reasonable one." She rolled her eyes. "I'm not doing this with you again. You know where to reach me." And just like that, she was gone again. That night, after Connor was asleep, I sat down with the separation papers again, trying to wrap my head around everything. I knew the road ahead wasn't going to be easy, but I also knew I couldn't back down. This wasn't just about me anymore, it was about Connor, and making sure he had the stable, loving home he deserved. The days leading up to our first legal meeting with the lawyers felt like a countdown to war. Jessica and I hadn't spoken since her last visit to the house, and the silence felt like a storm waiting to break. I was grateful for Connor's school schedule and the routines that kept me focused, but every quiet moment was filled with the weight of what was coming. The first meeting was set up to discuss temporary custody arrangements. It was supposed to be civil, but the tension in the room was palpable. Jessica sat across from me, her lawyer by her side, while Karen was at mine. Jessica looked composed, polished even, but her face was cold, her eyes avoiding mine. I could feel the gap between us growing wider with every passing second. It was surreal to sit across from the woman I'd once loved so deeply and feel nothing but anger and betrayal. The meeting began with pleasantries from the mediators, but those quickly gave way to the hard discussions. Jessica's lawyer started by proposing a joint custody arrangement, with Connor spending alternating weeks between our homes. "No," I said firmly, cutting her off. Jessica glared at me. "You're being unreasonable, Eric. Connor needs both of us." Karen jumped in. "Eric isn't disputing that both parents are important. But stability is critical, especially during this transitional period. Connor has been living primarily with Eric, and disrupting that routine would not be in his best interest." Jessica scoffed. "Disrupting his routine? He's my son, too. I've always been there for him." "Have you?" I asked, unable to keep the bitterness out of my voice. "Because it seems like you've been a little distracted lately." Jessica's lawyer cut in before she could respond. "Let's keep this professional. Personal grievances have no place in a custody discussion." "Personal grievances?" I shot back. "She's the one who brought my brother into this mess. How is that not relevant?" Karen placed a calming hand on my arm. "Eric, let's focus on Connor." She turned back to the mediator. "The facts are simple. Eric has been the primary caregiver, especially over the past year, while Jessica has prioritized her career. Connor's current routine is stable and supportive, and any changes should be made with extreme caution. Jessica's lawyer leaned forward, her tone sharp. Jessica's work schedule has allowed her to provide financially for Connor. That shouldn't be used against her. She's fully capable of offering him a loving and stable home. The conversation went back and forth like that for what felt like hours. I tried to keep my emotions in check, but every time Jessica spoke, I could feel my frustration bubbling just below the surface. She kept painting herself as the victim, conveniently ignoring the choices that had led us here. Finally, the mediator suggested a temporary arrangement. Connor would stay with me during the weekdays and spend weekends with Jessica. It wasn't ideal, but it was a start. As we left the meeting, Jessica shot me a look that I couldn't quite read, half anger, half something else. "This isn't over," she said quietly. "No," I replied, meeting her gaze. "It's not." The drive home felt heavy, but for the first time in weeks, I felt a small spark of hope. It wasn't much, but it was a step in the right direction. That night, I tucked Connor into bed and sat with him until he fell asleep. As I watched him, I reminded myself why I was fighting so hard. This wasn't just about winning, it was about giving him the stability and love he needed to thrive. The road ahead was still uncertain, but I knew one thing for sure: I wasn't going to let Jessica or David take that away from him, or me. The temporary custody arrangement worked, at least on paper. Connor stayed with me during the weekdays and spent weekends with Jessica. I kept him busy with school activities, playdates, and movie nights, trying to make our time together as normal as possible. But no amount of distractions could mask the growing tension. Connor started coming back from Jessica's weekends quieter, more withdrawn. At first, I thought it was just the stress of shuttling between two homes, but then he started saying little things that raised red flags. "Mom says it's your fault she had to leave," he blurted out one night during dinner. His fork paused in midair. I froze, my stomach twisting. "What do you mean, buddy?" "She said you're the reason we're not a family anymore," he said, his voice unsure, like he was testing the waters. I forced myself to stay calm. "Connor, sometimes grown-ups say things when they're upset. But what's happening between me and your mom is not your fault, okay? And it's not about blame. It's just complicated." He nodded, but I could tell he wasn't convinced. The next weekend, he came back with more troubling comments. "Mom says you don't want me to see Uncle David." I clenched my jaw, trying not to let my frustration show. "What else did she say?" "She said you're mad at her and Uncle David for no reason," he said, his little face scrunched in confusion. "Why are you mad at them, Dad?" I took a deep breath, choosing my words carefully. "Connor, there are some things you're too young to understand right now. But I promise you, everything I'm doing is to make sure you're safe and happy. That's all that matters." He seemed to accept that, but I couldn't shake the anger simmering beneath the surface. Jessica was weaponizing Connor, trying to paint me as the bad guy, and it was working. I brought it up with Karen during our next meeting. "She's turning him against me," I said, pacing her office. "I don't want to drag Connor into this mess, but she's not playing fair." Karen nodded, her expression serious. "Parental alienation is a big deal in custody cases. Judges don't look kindly on one parent trying to manipulate the child against the other. Keep documenting everything Connor says, and we'll address it if it continues." Her advice was sound, but it didn't make it any easier. Every time Connor came back with another comment, it felt like another crack in the foundation I was trying to build. Then, the real bombshell dropped. One Friday evening, just as I was getting dinner ready, there was a knock at the door. I opened it to find a man standing there, holding a stack of papers. "Eric?" he asked. "Yeah? You've been served," he said, handing me the papers and walking away without another word. I closed the door and sat down at the table, my hands trembling as I opened the envelope. It was a formal petition from Jessica, requesting a modification to the custody arrangement. She was asking for full custody of Connor, citing concerns about Eric's emotional stability and fitness as a parent. I stared at the papers in disbelief. Emotional stability? Fitness as a parent? This was Jessica's new strategy, attacking me, painting me as the problem. I called Karen immediately. She wasn't surprised. This is a common tactic in contentious custody cases, she said. But don't panic. We'll counter it with evidence of your involvement in Connor's life and the stability you provide. And if she wants to make this about emotional fitness, we'll make sure the court sees the full picture. The full picture. That included David, the affair, and the lies. It was time to stop holding back. That weekend I sat down and went through every piece of evidence I'd collected. The messages between Jessica and David, the photos, the inconsistencies in her behavior, it all painted a picture of a woman who had prioritized her affair over her family. I knew this fight was about to get ugly, but I was ready. For Connor's sake, I had to be. When Monday rolled around, Karen filed our response to Jessica's petition, including a request for a court-appointed child psychologist to evaluate Connor's well-being. If Jessica wanted to play dirty, I was prepared to fight back with everything I had. But the hardest part was knowing that no matter who won, the real casualty in all of this was Connor. The day of the first court hearing arrived faster than I was ready for. It felt like stepping onto a battlefield, armed with nothing but a stack of papers and the hope that the truth would matter. I arrived at the courthouse early, dressed in a suit that felt stiff and uncomfortable, trying to project the image of a composed, stable father. Jessica arrived shortly after, with David in tow. Seeing him walk into that building, into a fight about my son, nearly made me lose my composure. He was wearing his typical smug expression, like he was untouchable. Jessica looked confident, polished, as though this was just another meeting for her. Karen placed a reassuring hand on my arm as we walked into the courtroom. Remember, Eric, stay calm. Don't let them provoke you. This is about Connor, and the court needs to see that you're focused on him. The hearing started with both sides presenting their cases. Jessica's lawyer, a sharp-tongued woman named Dana, wasted no time painting me as unstable. She highlighted the strain in my marriage, suggested that my anger toward Jessica and David made me unfit to make rational decisions for Connor, and even insinuated that my obsession with documenting everything was a sign of paranoia. I kept my face neutral, but inside, I was boiling. When it was Karen's turn, she didn't hold back. She laid out the timeline of events, highlighting Jessica's affair and the disruption it had caused in Connor's life. She emphasized that I had been Connor's primary caregiver, providing stability while Jessica prioritized her career, and later, her relationship with David. But the real turning point came when Karen introduced the messages I'd found between Jessica and David. They weren't just evidence of the affair. They revealed Jessica's dismissive attitude toward our family. Your Honor, Karen said, her voice steady. These messages show a clear pattern of deception and disregard for the stability of Connor's home life. Eric has demonstrated his commitment to providing a loving and stable environment, and we believe that's what's in Connor's best interest. Jessica's face hardened as the messages were read aloud. David sat stiffly, his usual smugness replaced with a look of discomfort. For the first time, I felt like the truth was on my side. The judge listened carefully, occasionally asking questions, but it was clear this was only the beginning. At the end of the hearing, the judge decided to maintain the temporary custody arrangement until a full evaluation could be completed. Both Jessica and I were ordered to meet with a court-appointed child psychologist to assess Connor's emotional well-being. As we left the courtroom, Jessica shot me a venomous look. You think this is over? It's not. I didn't respond. I just walked out, Karen by my side, focusing on the small victory we'd secured. That evening, I sat with Connor as he worked on his school project. He chattered about dinosaurs, completely unaware of the battle unfolding around him. It broke my heart to think about what he might face as this process dragged on. Later, after Connor was asleep, I called Karen. What's next? I asked. We'll prepare for the psychologist's evaluation, she said. Be honest, focus on Connor, and don't let Jessica's actions distract you. Judges listen to these professionals, so it's critical to show that your priority is his well-being. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of meetings, preparation, and trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy for Connor. The sessions with the child psychologists were both heartbreaking and cathartic. Connor opened up about the tension he'd felt at home, his confusion about the separation, and his love for both his parents. The psychologist's final report was bittersweet. While it acknowledged my strong bond with Connor and my ability to provide stability, it also highlighted the emotional toll the separation was taking on him. When the second court hearing came, I felt more prepared, but the stakes were higher. Jessica's lawyer pushed hard for joint custody, arguing that denying Connor significant time with his mother would harm him in the long run. But Karen countered with evidence of Jessica's inconsistent presence and the messages between her and David. "This isn't about denying a mother her rights," Karen said. "This is about ensuring Connor has the stability and emotional support he needs." The judge listened carefully, weighing every word. By the end of the hearing, a decision was made. I was awarded primary custody, with Jessica granted visitation rights. The judge made it clear that Connor's well-being was the priority and that both parents needed to focus on supporting him, not fighting each other. As I left the courtroom, I felt a wave of relief, but it was bittersweet. This wasn't a victory, it was just the best outcome for Connor under the circumstances. Jessica avoided me as she left, David trailing behind her. I didn't care. My focus was on Connor and giving him the life he deserved. That night, as I tucked Connor into bed, he looked up at me and said, "Are things going to be okay now, Dad?" I nodded, smiling through the ache in my chest. "Yeah, buddy. Things are going to be okay." For the first time in weeks, I believed it. The days after the court ruling felt surreal. For the first time in months, there was a sense of clarity, an understanding of what my new life would look like. The weight of uncertainty was still there, but it was lighter now, manageable. I had primary custody of Connor, and for the moment, that was enough. Jessica didn't take the ruling well. Her texts became more frequent and more aggressive. At first, it was about logistical things, when she could see Connor, how we'd handle holidays, what times she'd pick him up. But then the messages shifted. "You've poisoned him against me," she wrote one evening. "You've turned him into your little soldier." I stared at the screen, shaking my head. Connor adored his mom, that much hadn't changed, no matter what she claimed. But Jessica couldn't see that. She was so caught up in her own narrative of victimhood that she refused to acknowledge the consequences of her choices. David, for his part, had gone quiet. He wasn't at Jessica's side during her scheduled visits with Connor, which I was grateful for. The thought of my brother being a part of my son's life made my stomach turn, but at least, for now, it seemed like Jessica was keeping him at a distance. Connor and I settled into a new rhythm. The house felt quieter without Jessica, but it was a good kind of quiet, peaceful, not tense. I focused on making our time together special, whether it was cooking breakfast on Saturday mornings, building elaborate Lego cities, or simply sitting on the couch watching his favorite dinosaur documentaries. One evening, a couple of weeks after the ruling, Connor and I were playing a board game when he suddenly said, "I miss Mom." I looked up from the game, my chest tightening. "I know, buddy. It's okay to miss her." "Do you miss her?" he asked, his small hands fiddling with one of the game pieces. I hesitated, not wanting to lie but also not wanting to burden him with the truth. "I miss the good times we had as a family," I said carefully. "But things change, and sometimes grown-ups have to make hard choices." He nodded, his little face thoughtful. "Do you think Mom misses us?" "Of course she does," I said. "She loves you very much, Connor. No matter what, that's one thing you can always count on." He smiled, and I felt a small wave of relief. These conversations were never easy, but I knew they were important. Jessica's first scheduled weekend visit came and went without incident. She picked Connor up on time, brought him back when she was supposed to, and didn't try to engage in any drama. Connor seemed happy enough when he returned, though he was quieter than usual. "Did you have fun with Mom?" I asked him as I tucked him into bed that night. "Yeah," he said, but his tone was hesitant. "What's wrong, buddy?" He hesitated, then said, "Mom and Uncle David were there." My stomach dropped. "Oh," I said, keeping my voice steady. "Did you spend a lot of time with Uncle David?" He shrugged. "A little. He was nice, but it felt weird." I wanted to scream, to call Jessica and demand an explanation, but I knew it wouldn't help. Instead, I hugged Connor tightly and said, "If anything ever makes you uncomfortable, you can always talk to me about it, okay? No matter what." "Okay, Dad," he said, snuggling into the covers. After he fell asleep, I sat in the living room, staring at my phone. I thought about texting Jessica, but I knew it would only lead to another argument. Instead, I called Karen the next morning to let her know. "We can't stop her from having David around during her visitation unless there's a proven risk to Connor's safety," Karen said. "But keep documenting everything. If Connor starts expressing discomfort, or if there's any indication that David's presence is negatively impacting him, we can revisit the custody agreement." It wasn't the answer I wanted, but it was something. In the meantime, I focused on building a life for Connor and me, a life where he felt safe, loved, and supported. It wasn't easy, and there were still days when the weight of everything felt overwhelming. But every time Connor laughed or smiled, it reminded me why I was doing this. Jessica had taken a lot from me, but she couldn't take my son. And for now, that was enough. The weeks after Connor's mention of David were a strange mix of calm and tension. Jessica stuck to the custody arrangement, and for the most part, our interactions were minimal. She'd pick Connor up and drop him off without coming inside, and I avoided asking too many questions about what happened during her time with him. Connor seemed to adjust well to the new routine, but there were moments when I could see the toll it was taking. He'd ask questions like, "Why can't we all live together again?" Or, "Why don't you like Uncle David anymore?" Each time, I'd give him the gentlest answer I could muster, but it never felt like enough. One evening, as Connor and I were playing video games, he paused mid-game and said, "Mom says Uncle David might move in with her." The words hit me like a freight train. I put down the controller and turned to him, keeping my voice calm. "Did she say when that might happen?" He shook his head. "She just said maybe. She asked if I'd like it, but I didn't know what to say." I felt the familiar anger bubbling up, but I pushed it down. "You can always tell Mom how you feel, buddy. And if you're not comfortable, it's okay to say so." He nodded, but I could tell he was still processing the idea. After I tucked him into bed that night, I called Karen again. "She's planning to have him move in," I said, pacing the living room. "Connor told me she's already brought it up to him." Karen sighed. "It's not illegal for her to have David in her home, Eric, and the court won't intervene unless we can show that it's harmful to Connor. But the fact that she's involving Connor in the decision-making could work in your favor. Keep a record of what he says, and if this becomes a pattern, we'll address it." Her words made sense, but they didn't bring me much comfort. I couldn't shake the image of Connor having to live part of his life in the house with David, a man who had no right to be part of my family anymore. The next weekend, Connor came back from Jessica's house with the drawing he'd made, a picture of himself, Jessica, and David standing in front of a house. "Look, Dad," he said excitedly. "I made it at Mom's. She said it's what our house might look like if Uncle David moves in." I forced a smile, my heart breaking as I took the picture. "It's a nice drawing, Connor. You're really good at this." But inside I was seething. Jessica wasn't just introducing David into Connor's life, she was actively trying to normalize him as part of their family. That night, I sent Jessica a carefully worded text. "Jessica, I understand you want to include David in your life, but please be mindful of how this impacts Connor. He's still adjusting to the separation, and involving him in these kinds of decisions isn't fair to him." She didn't reply right away, but when she did, it was exactly what I expected. "Stop trying to control my life. Connor is fine, and he likes David. You're just making this harder than it needs to be." I didn't respond. There was no point. The following week, during one of Connor's therapy sessions with the court-appointed psychologist, he brought up the possibility of David moving in. "I don't know if I want it," he said, fidgeting with a toy. "I like Uncle David, but it feels weird." The psychologist asked him why it felt weird, and Connor shrugged. "Because Dad doesn't like him. And I don't want Dad to be mad." Hearing that broke me. Connor was caught in the middle of something he didn't understand, trying to navigate a situation that no child should ever have to face. When the psychologist's report came in, it included a note about Connor's discomfort with David's potential involvement. It wasn't a smoking gun, but it was something. Karen and I prepared to use the report in court, knowing that this was likely to be a long fight. But for now, I focused on the small victories, Connor's laughter, his growing confidence, and the bond we were rebuilding, one day at a time. The weeks leading up to the next court date were grueling. I poured every ounce of energy into preparing my case while keeping life as normal as possible for Connor. I wanted him to feel safe, loved, and free of the chaos swirling around us. But the weight of what was coming was always there, lurking just beneath the surface. Jessica, meanwhile, was ramping up her efforts. I heard through mutual friends that she and David were openly discussing their future together. It was clear that her endgame was not just to integrate David into Connor's life but to normalize their relationship entirely, regardless of how it might affect our son. The court date finally arrived on a rainy Tuesday morning. As I walked into the courthouse with Karen by my side, I felt a mix of dread and determination. Jessica and David were already there. She was dressed in her usual polished style, her expression unreadable. David stood beside her, his hands in his pockets, wearing that smug, condescending smirk that had come to define him in my mind. The hearing focused on two key points: Jessica's petition for expanded custody and our concerns about the psychological impact of David's involvement in Connor's life. Karen had prepared meticulously, and as the proceedings began, her calm confidence steadied me. Jessica's lawyer went first, painting her as a devoted mother who wanted nothing more than to give Connor a happy, balanced life. She argued that my objections to David were rooted in personal animosity, not genuine concern for Connor's well-being. Karen countered with the psychologist's report, emphasizing Connor's discomfort with the situation and his expressed feelings of being caught in the middle. She highlighted Jessica's actions, introducing David into Connor's life so quickly, involving him in discussions about their future together, as examples of poor judgment that prioritized her relationship over Connor's emotional needs. The turning point came when Karen introduced the messages between Jessica and David. She read aloud the ones where they mocked me, dismissed Connor's feelings, and strategized about how to make their relationship more palatable to the court. The judge's face hardened as the messages were read, and for the first time, I saw Jessica's confidence falter. David, who had been sitting quietly in the back of the courtroom, shifted uncomfortably. He avoided looking at me, which was fine. I didn't need him to. His actions had spoken louder than any words could. When it was my turn to speak, I kept my focus on Connor. I talked about the routines we'd built, the stability I'd worked hard to provide, and my commitment to giving him the love and support he needed to thrive. I avoided attacking Jessica directly, even though every fiber of my being wanted to call her out for what she'd done. Instead, I let the evidence speak for itself. The judge took everything into consideration, including the psychologist's report, the evidence of Jessica's affair, and our respective testimonies. After what felt like an eternity, the ruling was delivered. I was awarded full legal and physical custody of Connor. Jessica was granted supervised visitation, with the stipulation that David was not to be present during those visits. The judge was clear in their reasoning. Jessica's decisions had shown a pattern of prioritizing her relationship with David over Connor's emotional well-being, and that could not be ignored. As the gavel came down, a wave of relief washed over me. It wasn't about winning, it was about protecting Connor and giving him the stable, loving environment he deserved. Jessica stormed out of the courtroom without a word, David trailing behind her. I didn't watch them leave. I just sat there, letting the weight of the moment sink in. When I got home that evening, Connor was waiting for me. He ran up and hugged me tightly, his little arms wrapping around my waist. "Dad, are we okay now?" he asked, looking up at me with those big, hopeful eyes. "We're more than okay," I said, my voice thick with emotion. We're going to be just fine. That night, as I sat on the couch watching Connor play with his toys, I felt something I hadn't felt in months: peace. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but I knew we'd face it together. For the first time in a long time, I felt like we had a chance to heal.